Okay. So what we did was we actually investigated whether data on life satisfaction is interpersonally comparable. Is your 6 the same as my 6 out of 10? We investigated whether they're sort of linear. Anthony will talk more about this. So what that means is the difference between a 3 and a 4 roughly the same as the difference between a 6 and a 7? And then what we also looked at is this question of neutrality, which is a question about when we should be indifferent between a life continuing and a life ending. And I realize this is a very controversial sort of topic, and I'm mostly confused about this topic. And so because I thought, okay, I want to focus on this most because I'm most confused about that. And I hope you can sort of help me with this. Okay, so what's the starting point here? The starting point essentially is that we have this well-being data, and it's great if we're a technocrat and we want to select policies. You know, we can take that number, take the policy that produces a higher number and choose it, right? Unless we are Mark Fabian. Now, the problem with this is that what we will then do is we will exclusively make our choices on the basis of the quality of life. But at least on one plausible moral theory, what we should also care about is essentially the quantity of life, or how long we essentially live. And with the current kind of well-being data, we essentially have no way to make trade-offs between the length of life, or the quantity of it, and its quality. And the reason for that is, you know, this question. The reason for that is essentially because we don't know the location of what might be called the neutral point. So let me just give a motivating example. Suppose we're a policymaker and we have these two interventions A and B. And what intervention A does, well, it will raise the life satisfaction of, let's say, 100 people from a baseline level of a life satisfaction of 7 out of 10 to 7.5 for their entire life. But there won't be a change in the length of life. And the baseline, let's say, is 70 years of life. Okay, so that's intervention A. Intervention B, in contrast, doesn't do anything to your quality of life. All that it will do is extend the length of life for each individual, let's say each of these 100 people, by 10 years. So the question now is, which of these two interventions should we choose? Does anyone want to make a choice? Yeah? On what does it depend? Okay, yeah. Yeah, okay, so I should have stated this is a good point. In B, and it's a very important point, in B, let's say it's again the same baseline of 7 out of 10. That's the baseline here. Good that you're pointing this out. So we're considering their entire lives, and we're assuming that they're all throughout their entire life have a life satisfaction of 7. All right. So what we need to know is to know this neutral point. So the point at which we are indifferent from the perspective of a social planner between death and continued existence. Okay, so a couple of assumptions that go kind of counter to what Sophia has said. So what we're saying is essentially a couple of things. The first one is that at each moment in time, a person I's well-being, let's call this WIT, is completely determined by their life satisfaction at that moment T. And what we're interested in is actually to maximize the total well-being in the population, which is just a summation over all people and over all times. You could also here use an average, but I happen to be a totalist utilitarian rather than an average utilitarian. It doesn't make a difference in this particular case. And what we're also here assuming, unlike Anthony, is that life satisfaction reports are comparable and actually linear in underlying satisfaction. So just take them to be a cardinal measure of welfare. And so then if we go through the calculations in two cases, so the first case is where we think that actually the neutral point is at 0 out of 10. So at 1 out of 10, we would still prefer to be alive, but at 0 out of 10, we would prefer not to be alive. So if we then go through this calculation of what total well-being is, well, what we then find is that actually intervention B, the one that extends our lives, is actually the better intervention. However, if we now instead believe that actually the neutral point is at a 4 out of 10, what we would then find, if we then go again through that calculation, where we now have to essentially take that subtraction from the raw life satisfaction data, what we would then suddenly find is that the intervention where only well-being is raised, but not the quantity of life or the length of life, actually that intervention would be better. So it turns out that it is possible for interventions, and I have in the additional slides, I have a real world example of that the neutral point makes a difference when we have to make those kinds of choices. And I believe that in most kinds of cases, we are facing these kinds of choices. But most sort of things in life, like income, like unemployment, like the kinds of things that we're normally interested in, they will affect both quality of life and length of life. And then we're in this sort of situation where we have to make some sort of trade-off of that sort. So how can we find the neutral point? Well, as a sort of subjective well-being kind of person, I immediately thought, or we thought, well, we should just ask people. So that's literally the question that we asked in this pilot. And that is, at what level of life satisfaction would your life cease being worth living for you, disregarding any effects your life might have on others? The reason why we added this sort of proviso, disregarding any effects your life might have on others, is because we don't want people to think about, okay, if my life ends now and I have a child, then the well-being of my child would be very negatively affected. So we wanted people to disregard those kinds of considerations. Whether we were successful, I don't know, but that's the sort of thing. And we actually implemented that question, a variant of that question in the SEP-IS module. Some of you might know from the socioeconomic panel. Unfortunately, and I tried to bicker them to give me the data for this conference, but the guy is on holiday, so it didn't happen. So that's too bad. Okay, so that's essentially what we did. The N is ridiculously small. I'm sorry for that. We were funding constrained. So essentially what we see is that the vast majority of people essentially set the 0 point or the neutral point at 0. But there's a bunch of people for whom that's not quite true. We don't really know what to make of people who set the neutral point at like a 7 out of 10 or an 8 out of 10. You might think that they are sort of misanthropes that think that life is always not worth living, sort of that sort of thing. I'm not entirely sure. 6 participants also responded with other, where in the free text responses, people sometimes said, life is always worth living. Also, again, not entirely sure what to make of those kinds of statements. It doesn't really compute for me, but maybe it computes for you. And if so, please tell me how to make sense of that. When we compute the mean of this, we get a neutral point, a mean neutral point of 1.26. So that seems like a first idea for the neutral point for further assessment. But what might be wrong with this approach? And I think that's kind of important because this is a very ethically laden kind of question. So the first problem that we have, and we only realized that afterwards, that we actually have a sort of downward bias in the neutral point from hope. So the idea is we didn't actually specify here that people's life satisfaction wouldn't again change over their life course. So they might have a hope that then at some point in their lives, their life satisfaction would increase again. And so what that would then imply is that the number they select would actually be lower than the true number because they would hope to at some point go up again. So that's one bias that downwardly biases the estimated neutral point with that kind of question. The second thing is that we might suffer here from fairly poor effective forecasting. So we know that people are generally bad at like forecasting, what their future well-being will be like and what that would actually mean for them. And so one thing that we implemented is just, again, with this fairly small n, if the neutral point, essentially the stated neutral point varies with a person's reported current life satisfaction. So if effective forecasting was like a real problem, we would expect sort of a strong correlation between your current life satisfaction and where you set the neutral point. But as it turns out, that, again, n is tiny, but it turns out that this relationship is actually super small. Don't be fooled by the fact that, there is a downwardly sloping line. The coefficient is fairly small and super statistically insignificant. So I wouldn't expect to see much there, which in some senses is evidence against this worry about effective forecasting. The second thing to note is that if effective forecasting were a problem, I would have expected that regression slope to be sloping upwards, right? Where people who are higher up the life satisfaction scale would say that the number at which they would be neutral would actually be lower, but it's the other way around. Okay, So, but still probably this question has some biases. So here's an alternative approach, which I think might be even more controversial than the first one. And so what happened was, in the share data set and a couple of other data sets, they asked the following question. In the last month, have you felt that you would rather be dead? Well, that's fairly close to what we're looking at, right? And so what the idea here is, if you're thinking, I would rather be dead, you're probably below the neutral point. Otherwise, you wouldn't be saying that. So then the question is just, okay, how do answers to this particular question correlate with people's self-reported life satisfaction? So I produced this graph here, which essentially gives, for each category on the life satisfaction scale, the share of people who said, I would rather, or I've been thinking over the last month to rather be dead than alive. And what we notice, first of all, sort of encouraging, I think, for life satisfaction data more generally, that we have this sort of super strong, downwardly sloping association that's mostly linear apart from the people at the 9s and the 10s. So maybe the 9s and the 10s aren't really all that different from one another. When I then compute the mean life satisfaction among people who said that they had this sort of suicidal ideation, I actually get a really, really large number. I get 5.98 as the mean life satisfaction among people who say that they have this sort of suicidal ideation. But of course, there's also problems with this sort of idea. The first one is that actually you get an upward bias from just within month variation. So what this question asked was, okay, have you been thinking that you'd rather be dead over the last entire month? So it might well be that, you know, the moments in which they thought that were the moments of like least life satisfaction during that month, but I'm only recording current life satisfaction. So when there's within month variation in life satisfaction, then this would lead to a upward bias in the estimated neutral point based on that kind of approach. So one thing that one could do, and we're planning to do this, is to just tweak this question, and instead of asking in the last month, were you thinking that you would rather be dead, we would actually just ask yesterday, were you thinking that you would rather be dead, in order to reduce the sort of problem from within month variation. Second thing that one can do is just to ask about the lowest level of life satisfaction during the entirety of the month. And then conditional on an assumption that they have sort of perfect memory, or at least not crazily faulty memory, you could again get rid of this upward bias. Again, here you would actually have a downward bias in the neutral point from concerns about others, right? You might think, oh, I would rather be dead, but I might not allow myself to think that because I'm, you know, worried, for example, about my children or my loved ones. So in that case, we would again have a downward bias, but I don't think it would be as strong. So, okay. There's also a couple of other methods that we haven't yet explored. In the interest of time, I don't know what Anthony is saying about time. Oh, 5 minutes, okay. So one thing that one could do, and actually Killingsworth Matt Killingsworth has done this sort of pilot where he essentially asked people whether we're given a sort of activity, and then they were asked, would you skip this particular moment at this particular level of life satisfaction? So that's one other way of trying to get at the neutral point. The problem with that is that people might have sort of inconsistent preferences over time spans. So the idea might be that, yeah, you would be willing to skip a moment, like the next 10 minutes at a life satisfaction level of a 6. And so you say, yeah, I would definitely skip that. Then I ask you, well, would you also skip that moment if it were a year long? And you might still say, yeah, maybe I would skip that. And then I ask you, okay, would you skip the rest of your life with that? Then you might maybe start to say, no, I would not skip it. I would want to remain alive at that level. But in that case, you would essentially have inconsistent preferences about the kinds of levels of well-being at which you would be willing to experience these moments. And that would sort of go counter the idea that, you know, your well-being is additively separable in all those moments. And so I wouldn't really want to ask that question, because I think you would just get into a mess, because people tend to have stated inconsistent preferences. That's at least my guess. There's also a bunch of other issues that I'm just going to quickly go through, and then I hope that you can help me deconfuse me a little bit. So the first one is, and that I think also relates to Sophia's presentation, is that actually, if you want to do policy analysis based on both the quantity and quality of life, then you can often have sort of strongly anti-egalitarian conclusions. The idea here would be that you can construct cases in which a policy would have one group with low base level of well-being that would increase these people's well-being a lot, would increase the length of life a lot, but the policy would still be dominated in terms of total well-being by another policy that would only benefit people with high levels of well-being. So you can show that where you essentially no one is benefited more. Actually, the policy would be anti-egalitarian, but it would still be preferred from that viewpoint, and that might be, not what we want for other normative reasons. Although I wouldn't be one of them, but I think many have these sort of egalitarian tendencies. Another sort of broader problem is sort of what's actually the right account of the badness of death. So what I've been assuming in this talk is essentially deprivationism. Deprivationism essentially says the badness of death is given by the extent to which you were deprived of what life you could have had. But at least in the philosophical literature, there are sort of competitors to this view. One view is the Epicurean view, which essentially says, maybe some of you are familiar with that view, that once you're dead, you cannot be harmed anymore. So your death is no harm for you. So under that sort of notion, actually, we should just ignore the length of life, I guess. Some would that, again, find implausible, but I know at least a couple of Epicureans. So it's at least on the table. So the question is, how should we sort of make sense of the uncertainty over what the right account of the badness of death is? Maybe a final problem, and that is that it seems to be that there's sort of an asymmetry between ending lives and creating lives. So in that kind of framework, I sort of treated ending lives and creating lives symmetrically. But it seems to me that people will often have, at least in stated terms, a difference of preference over whether to end a life and at which point we should be willing to end a life or to no longer extend a life, and at which level of well-being we should be willing to create a life. So you might have the belief that, okay, I'm wondering, should I get a child now? And I'm told, well, your child is going to live a life with a life satisfaction level of 4 out of 10. You might not be willing to have that child, right? Because it would be a fairly low level of well-being. Yet at the same time, if you're then wondering, should I want to end my life when I'm at a 4 out of 10, you might say, no, actually, I would want to continue that life, even though it's a fairly low level of well-being. So there seems to be this asymmetry between neutral points concerning the end of life and neutral point concerning the beginning of life. We should make some sort of sense for that if we want to use well-being data together with data on the length of life and fertility to make policy choices. There's lots more to talk about here, but I think I will just end here. Just what I want to say is that there are trade-offs between the quantity and quality of life. I think they're fairly pervasive. We need to know the neutral point to make these kinds of choices. The kind of data that I have gives this fairly long, broad width of like somewhere between 1.3 and 5.8, where I don't know. I think there's some potential for reducing this bias with sort of better questions and more data, but there's these lingering conceptual issues that I'm really worried about. And so that's what I have here. Thank you. Sure.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Caspar. I have 2 questions. And if you go back to the slide with motivating example, it would be easier for me to state that question. So the first one is your first example where the indifference point is 0. Is it the case that this is equivalent to using well-bees, or the quality adjusted life here is in the medical science literature? So I guess that's a yes or no question. And the second one is a bit longer. So your second case worries me a bit, because in your example, you have happy people of 7.5 and 7, but assume that you have people or countries, whoever these entities are, of 3 and 5. which means that a part of your sample is under your indifference point, which means that extending their lives gonna damage your total well-being, which, well, I understand how the neutral point is of scientific interest for informing suicide prevention and other useful things. But as a policy tool, if the policy recommendation out of this is not extending lives of people in misery, that sounds a bit dangerous. Thank you.
I'm also a bit skeptical. So, you know, there's a stated preference versus a revealed preference here. So I would be tempted to oversample people who are on their deathbeds. Ask them what their life is and whether or not they would rather be dead. You know, and I think you're going to get, because you have a whole bunch of people who have never experienced a 2 before or a 4, you know, and then when they're actually there, I think most people actually want to continue living. That's my own personal bias, of course. And then so my a question might be, what percentage of people actually do prefer to want to be dead? So it'd be nice to know that number, and then compare that with suicide statistics. And then you might even compare it with not just suicide, because suicide has huge cultural, religious components, but also the deaths of despair literature more broadly. Because I'm very skeptical at what kind of any survey response you get from this.
So I think some other folks' questions maybe have kind of gotten at what I'm wondering, but I think question number 1, I just want to hear from you, like, given these deep conceptual concerns that you mentioned, like, do you feel like this is like actually an answerable question for real? And then I think maybe related is if you can say a bit more about what you're understanding, sort of like the application of the answer to this question to be, or like specifically the sort of like policy or practical relevance of an answer to this question.
Right. Okay. Kelsey's comment on deaths of despair is very relevant, I think, because there is an overwhelming literature in epidemiological studies showing that the best predictor of longevity is happiness at earlier stages of life. So I'm not sure of the practical relevance of the trade-off between quantity and quality of life that you're mentioning. Usually, they go in the same direction.
Caspar, I don't know if you looked at, there is a huge literature in social choice theory that studied similar issues. I'm thinking about the work around Kotaro Suzumura and Walter Bossert, all the work they did. So you may want to see what they've been doing there. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I will try to do this all in 1 minute. Okay, so first question. First case, are these just well-bees? Well, yes, they are, in the sense in which well-bees have, for example, been defined in your paper with Richard Layard. But there you explicitly said the neutral point is a 0, right? And sort of this questions this assumption. You know, the neutral point could also be negative, right? That's possible too. We could talk about that, but I think it can be negative. Okay. So then I agree with the idea of oversampling particularly badly off people. I tried to sort of get at this idea by essentially, okay, let's run a regression of current life satisfaction on the stated neutral point and see if there's an association. Of course, if I have now, what we're planning to have is roughly 2,000 people, then I think this will become more credible. But I think the oversampling is a good idea because those seem to be more relevant or better place to give this sort of answer. I really like the idea of, if you can somehow get this past an ethics committee, to literally bluntly ask the question, would you, if there were no negative consequences to those around you, would you prefer right now to be dead? I don't think you can get this past an ethics committee, but it would be, I think it would be the question that would be closest to what we want to have. Then the question, is this a really answerable question? And I'm completely uncertain about this. So you might think that this is answerable insofar as we want to fully sort of respect people's stated preferences. And then the kind of question that Kelsey asked, or proposed would be sort of, I guess, sort of a gold standard. I think you would have to fiddle around with it. Those questions wouldn't be the gold standard, but are easier to get past ethics committees. But it might not be answerable because there are philosophical issues lurking in the background that aren't answerable using social science methods. And if that's the case, the kinds of standards of science couldn't apply anymore to the neutral point, and then it wouldn't be an answerable question. I would be really sad if that turned out to be true, because it would mean that we could never make the sort of trade-off that I set out at the very beginning. And that would leave us sort of with a gap in our understanding of, the social world and how we can choose policy. Question on quantity and quality often go in the same direction. I agree, that's true. But suppose both policies go in the same direction, but one policy emphasizes extending length of life, I don't know, more investment into intensive care, let's say, might also increase well-being to some extent, but might not emphasize that. Another policy costs the same money, switches this around. Then again, although it again goes both times in the same direction, you still have a trade-off, and you are now uncertain about which of the two policies you should choose as a technocrat. I know some of the work of Walter Bossert, but I will look further into this and write you an email, Conchita. I hope that was quick enough.